Okay, hello, Troy Howarth. So we'll be talking about Dark Glasses today, but you wrote a book on its director called Murder by Design: The Unsane Cinema of Dario Argento. Tell people what they could get from that book.
Well, hopefully a fairly well-informed and somewhat objective overview of the man's lengthy career, his life, and also his various works, not only in the cinema, but going back to his early days as a film critic,
Hmm.
then working his way up the ladder as a screenwriter, and then becoming a director, and really becoming a specialist in horror and suspense. Really covers everything up until right before the movie we're here to talk about. And quite frankly, at the time, I thought that was pretty much the end of the story. I mean, he hadn't made a film in so long at that point. I figured that might be the end of it. There were intentions and designs and desires to make films, but I didn't know it was actually going to happen. So yeah, here we are with a new film. Dark Glasses, his first film in a decade, which came as a great surprise. It actually came to be.
Yeah. Oh, wow. This is cool. This is like the cherry on the cake. But I feel like I'm getting a scoop here. So, did you feel that Dark Glasses was surprisingly good, like I did?
Yeah, I think it's a really solid film. I wouldn't say it's a great film. It's not Deep Red, it's not Tenebrae, it's not Inferno. But I mean, a good solid film for 21st century Dario Argento is about what we could hope for, realistically speaking. Now I want to clarify that by saying I'm not one of these people that's been sort of, you know, acting extremely indignant for years that his films have been terrible and he needs to give it up and he needs to walk away. I don't believe that. But I do think it fell in an interesting place in his career, and that from my point of view, in a way, he had made three films in a row that I thought were quite bad, quite frankly. Three feature films in a row that were quite bad, and another TV film right before it, which was not all that great either. So to have a film like this, which I think is probably the best feature he's made since the Stendhal Syndrome in 1996, is pretty substantial. It's not as good as Stendhal Syndrome, which I think is probably likely to remain his last great film from my point of view. Although I'm well aware that it's not beloved by a lot of people. A lot of people have problems with that film. I do not. I think it's a great film, but I do think this one's the best one since then, and that was reason for celebration.
So I was really cheering when I saw the black gloves in Dark Glasses. So how did you feel when you saw those iconic black gloves pop back in?
Oh, it's always fun to see Argento working with his usual kind of recurring obsessive elements that we get over and over and over again in this films, going all the way back to when he made Bird with the Crystal Plumage in 1969. There's no mistaking a Dario Argento film. Now, of course, there are a lot of imitators at this point, a lot of people who have picked up the gauntlet that he thrown down, so to speak, and so a lot of the elements that one associates with his films have been picked up by other people: the black gloves, the point of view shots, things of that nature, um, very detailed murder set pieces, things like that. But to see him back in that milieu again is a lot of fun. Although this is a very unusual Giallo in some respects. I mean, it is Giallo, but at the same time, it's really not. It doesn't seem to me it's really designed to be a particularly surprising mystery. It's just kind of it's pretty obvious where it's going. It doesn't have a lot of plot twists or anything like that, but it has other surprises in store.
Yeah, for sure. I liked the sense of vulnerability in the movie when our main character goes blind, and so it's just like basically her and a kid, and it kind of reminds me of how in a lot of Hitchcock movies the guy will have some sort of issue, like James Stewart, being in a wheelchair and someone's
Yeah.
after him. It's just it feels so heightened and cinematic and exciting.
Well, it's a callback to his second feature, The Cat o' Nine Tails, where you
Mm.
have Carl Malden playing a blind former reporter who now spends his days, designing puzzles for the paper,
Mm.
because he's been kind of put out to pasture. Although the story shows quite plainly that he still has his sleuthing abilities intact despite his blindness. And in that film, he has a relationship with a little girl who calls him uncle. It's not really. He explains she's not really his niece. in a biological sense. They just sort of found each other and they find that they need each other. So there's this element of sort of loneliness that goes back in Argento's films. There's a melancholy quality, but this is, I think, one of the things I really like about this film, and it's one of the relatively few ones I would describe this way in Argento's filmography. Is there's a lot of warmth in it. The
Mm.
relationship between the prostitute character and the little boy, who, of course, they are sort of brought together violently and tragically, and become quite attached to one another. It recalls The Cat of Nine Tails. To an extent, also, another film of his, of his that I would describe as having that kind of warmth would be Trauma, which is one of the two American films that he made in the 1990s that are not terribly well regarded, although I think they're quite good. But Trauma has a certain warmth to it too, and I suppose also to an extent the relationship between David Hemmings and Daria Nicolodi in Deep Red, there is a warmth and a humanity in that. But it's definitely very strong in this film, and I think one of the things that really brought that out to the foreground, and I think made it a different film and frankly a better film, is that it was produced during the height of the COVID pandemic. Argento, as an older man, I mean, he at the time he made this film, he's about 80 years old. He is, he's feeling that sense of vulnerability as an older person. His health has been up and down in recent years. He's had some, stays in the hospital in recent, and COVID hits, and like a lot of people, he's scared. He's very afraid of what's going on, and he spent a lot of his time in his apartment. Didn't leave. Was extremely cautious. Was very, very, very much afraid of, catching this terrible illness and being exposed to it, and it probably would kill him. So he's coming to this probably from a different state of mind and a different place. There is this sense, again, the loneliness and so forth. You can see it in a lot of the earlier films. These characters are kind of isolated. They're kind of they're trapped in their own little worlds and things. Sometimes you see movies of his where we just sometimes just glimpse people looking out from windows. You get a sense, almost, it goes back to Bird with Crystal Plumage, that opening murder sequence, which everybody remembers, or the attempted murder sequence, where it's like it's unfolding in an aquarium. It's from behind this big plate glass sort of door, you get a sense of people who are trapped in sort of glass cages, and people who are disconnected and unable to communicate and so forth. So all these kind of elements have been there in his movies going all the way back to the very beginning. But there is a melancholy in this film. I think that's a good way to describe it, that really makes it stand out.
Cool. Very well said. And I liked well, one thing that I want to bring up is, you have movies like Amir or even Death Proof that are definitely going for a giallo vibe, right? But I think it's kind of incomparable when you have like Mr. Giallo himself kind of return to the genre. Do you agree with that sentiment? What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, it's a question of mentality, really, and with Argento, I mean, he came by it honestly because it's a field that he's been
Mm.
attached to from the very beginning, and the reason that he was attached to it from the very beginning is because his first film was so successful. I always explain this. I think it's important that people understand. It's kind of like what happened with Halloween. Halloween and Bird with the Crystal Plumage were not overnight box office smash hits. They took a while. It built up through word of mouth. It took a little while for them to become the successes they became. So when Bird with Crystal Plumage came out in February of 1970, it wasn't an instant smash. It wasn't like lines were around the block. It wasn't that way at all. The reviews were bad. The initial business wasn't different, but gradually, because more and more people started to see it and realize, hey, this is a really good film, it built up an interest in the public, and it ended up becoming very successful. Same thing happened later with John Carpenter with Halloween, where the movie came out, looked like it was going to be a dud. Carpenter pretty much said, well, I guess that's another one. I'll just move on to the next job, which in his case was Elvis. And it wasn't until a little bit later to realize this thing really, really had enormous legs, and it really taken off and been very successful. So Argento has been kind of in this genre for the better part of his career. Really, he's tried leaving a couple of different times, tried doing different projects and things, but ultimately always comes back to it. And so it's something that he's a real purist with. I think it comes out of a real understanding of this genre and its codes and everything that it's really about. Some of these other films you're talking about that are Giallo tribute films, Giallo homages, neo Gialli, whatever you want to call them. Although many of them aren't really Giallo films from my point of view, because I'm a purist in the sense that I think that a true Giallo has to be Italian. It's an Italian term, it's an Italian phenomenon. So I think it's, somewhat disingenuous to describe other films from other countries as being real Gialli. I'd say they're films in the Giallo style, they're Giallo homages, whatever you want to call them, but they're not real true blue Gialli. And in any way that, for example, like High Plains Drifter could be called a spaghetti western. I mean, it's in that style, but it's an American film. Spaghetti westerns, so-called spaghetti westerns, are specifically Italian. So I think these terms have some significance. So I'm a little stuffy about them, I suppose. I try to keep them consistent, but people who made the films like Amer and other things you're talking about, I think they're doing something different. And to be fair, it's probably just something that I'm not really all that in tune with, but I find a lot of those films to be rather pretentious and rather sort of self-important. And they lose sight of the fact that these films ultimately are kind of pulpy, slightly trashy films. And some of them are more elevated than others. Certainly many of Argento's films are. The Gialli films of people like Fulci and Mario Bava and people like that were of a higher caliber than some of the other ones, compared to like Giallo in Venice or Strip Nude for Your Killer and things like that, which are really, trashy films. But they are ultimately sort of commercial films with commercial aspirations, whereas these other films are art films that play at being genre pieces by using these elements. And they have their fans. I'm certainly not among them in general. There have been some that I've liked, like Barbarian Sound Studio. I thought was a very good film.
Yeah, that was fun.
But some of the other things, Amer and some of the other films of that nature, they haven't really done too much for me.
Fair enough. I was listening to a podcast, the Video Archives podcast, and it's Roger Avery, Quentin Tarantino, and Eli Roth was the guest, and they did a two-part series called American Giallo, and I want to see which ones you think would fit the bill, even though it's like you said you're a purist, and it's kind of like a made-up thing, but if there is entertainment for American Giallo, so Dress to Kill.
Yeah, Dress to Kill, definitely.
Alice, Sweet Alice.
Yeah.
The one, The Eyes of Laura Mars, I believe that's what it's called.
Yeah.
And then Happy Birthday to Me.
Yeah, I would say all those fit. I have three of the four of those in my third volume of So Deadly, So Perverse, which is about films in the Giallo style from across the globe. So I would add in things like, William Friedkin's Cruising, definitely.
Yeah.
Although its aspirations are very different in many respects, but still, it fits that sort of mold. And I'd say arguably the original Halloween and the original Friday the 13th as well. I mean, don't forget the original Friday the 13th is a mystery. And there is a twist. And the twist is made nonsensical by the sequels because, of course, it just created something out of whole cloth that was never really intended before. But they're very much in that style too. I mean, Carpenter was definitely very much influenced by Argento in particular. He admitted as much. So Halloween has a lot of that. I've always said Halloween is like, taking this very Baroque, very tricky, complicated sort of thing and stripping it down to its bare essentials and just making it a really, really effective sort of haunted house type of scenario, and it works remarkably well. So I'd say those choices all absolutely fit. There are other ones that come to mind too. I mean, it's a Canadian film, but I'm going to call it North American, whatever. Black Christmas is another one that comes to mind. The original. So yeah, there are many others, and De Palma in particular has made a number of films that fit that kind of aesthetic. So we could also add in, for example, Body Double would be another one, and probably Sisters as well.
So I heard, maybe you know more than I do about this, but that Argento was on the stage with Dark Glasses at Fright Fest, and he said he's shooting a movie in Paris this year.
He indicated, I know a bit about what it is, or
Hmm.
at least what is planned to be. More than has been made public, so I can't say, unfortunately.
Oh, okay.
He does have a specific, he has described as a remake of a 1940s Mexican film noir. I know what film it is.
Oh,
Um, I can't say,
oh,
unfortunately,
damn.
but
Yeah.
also it may depend whether it actually happens or not. Um,
Hmm.
he's very good, as many of these people are, at spinning stories, and it's hard to tell sometimes if it's actually true.
Hmm.
At one point, he was very insistent that Daft Punk was going to score Dark Glasses, for example, and but that nobody else ever seemed to say this
I
was
remember
true.
that. I
Um,
forgot, but that's funny. Yeah.
yeah, he said. I mean, and, maybe there were some talks. I don't know. It's hard to believe it in a way, but you never know. Um, this film is supposed to star the wonderful actress Isabelle Huppert, who
Nice.
is, a brilliant actress, probably one of the finest performers he's ever worked with, if it
Hmm.
comes to be. And knowing what the film is, knowing what the origin story is, and everything, it'd be a great vehicle for her.
Hmm.
If it happens. Now he's indicated it's supposed to be shot in Paris in the spring, so spring's right around the corner.
Hmm.
I guess we'll see. I was very skeptical about Dark Glasses ever coming to be, and it did. So I'm hoping that there's sufficient interest to make this happen. If it does happen, I think it could be a very, very interesting film.
Do you think there's the fuel for Dark Glasses to be kicking off a new Animal trilogy?
I don't think it wasn't particularly successful, to be honest. I mean,
Hmm.
the advantage with it was, A, it was very low budget,
Hmm.
and B, it secured worldwide sales, so it certainly made a profit. I can tell you that the Italian box office, it did not make a dent. Nobody cared. It didn't do well at all. It got very little, any kind, something like festival, art house type circuit play here, but
Yeah.
not any real major release over here. But I mean, putting it in context of what it cost and everything, I'm sure it counts as a profitable film. Um, I mean, the man is going to be 83 this September. That's not spring chicken, but there are directors who continue working well beyond that. So, I mean, if he's able to stay healthy and he's able to keep motivated and interested, I'm sure that he has all the desire in the world to keep making films. It's not like John Carpenter, who seems. I mean, he likes to tease people and say, "Oh well, I'm thinking about it. Don't rule the old guy out." But I'm just, at this point, it's kind of like, I don't think it's going to happen. I really don't think he
Mhm.
really wants to do it. I think if he really wanted to do it, he would find a way to do it. Argento, I think, really wants to do it, so that's a big thing. As long as his health stays good and that interest remains there, I'm sure he'll keep making films. I mean, the greatest thing about Dark Glasses for me is that ultimately, even if he doesn't make anything else, it means that Dracula will not be his last film. That's
Yeah.
reason for celebration.
I agree with that. So when I was watching Dark Glasses again 2 days ago, I was really enjoying the score, and I was
Yeah,
thinking it's like evil techno kind of.
yeah.
But it's by Arnaud Robotini, who, and as much as I love Goblin and Claudio and everything, I thought this was really terrific stuff. So, what were your thoughts of the music?
Oh, I like the score very much. I mean, again, there was this talk about getting Daft Punk to do it, and it does make you wonder. I'd be curious to see what might have happened with that. I'm not overly familiar with Rebatini apart from the score, I have to admit. So when I heard it, it definitely reminded me of what Simonetti did for The Card Player, which was a similar kind of techno soundtrack. And I like it. I think it's fairly propulsive, and it keeps the mood and the ambiance going. I really like the main theme, which, of course, as usual in these things, gets a lot of repetition and variations and so forth. So yeah, I think it's a very good score, and I think it's one of the great strengths of this film is that because of the way the film came together, it changed somewhat, it morphed somewhat. Different people dropped out who were originally supposed to be involved. And I think one of the great strengths is he found himself working with fresh new crew. I mean, apart from Sergio Stivoletti, who does the special effects as usual,
Hmm.
it's pretty much all new people, and I think that was very helpful in this context.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely. So I guess, how would you characterize Dario Argento's career after opera?
Well, I mean, there's a weird kind of entitlement mentality that a lot of fans have, which I've always found very strange and very slightly disturbing, where it's like if you make a bunch of films that people like, then they expect you to always make films that they're going to like, and
Hmm.
it's like if they make something you don't like, you somehow feel betrayed, and you somehow
Mhm.
feel, you know it was like Tarantino writing off Scorsese after Gangs of New York and saying, this is why directors should hang it up when they're 60. I think that's the most ridiculous thing. I mean,
Hmm.
it's ageist, it's ignorant. It's shockingly ignorant, as a matter of fact. I mean, so many great directors have made films since they're fine films into their 70s, sometimes 80s. Look at
Hmm.
Buñuel, for example, and it's inconceivable to me, this idea that these people don't owe us anything. Argento, if you like the earlier films, he has already given you something that's very precious. He doesn't owe you anything. So he did, after opera, he made, I wouldn't say an artistic mistake, but he made a business mistake by coming to America, trying to kind of conquer the American market, because that wasn't going to happen. His films are not the types of films that are renowned and revered over here, and they're too weird and they're too idiosyncratic, and
Hmm.
they're just not the type of thing that is well regarded in the American marketplace. So he came over here at a bad time too, because this was a really precarious moment in the Italian film industry. The
Hmm.
film industry in general was in crisis. Things were falling apart left and right. Careers were either ending, or directors were ending up going into television or making micro budgeted movies that didn't enable them to do their best work. Look at Lucio Fulci, for example. Um, Argento had managed to maintain a great commercial consistency throughout the 80s with opera. But then after that, unfortunately, he's making films that aren't successful anymore. And sometimes even films he produced, like The Sect, Michele Soavi film that he
Hmm.
produced, was not successful.
Hmm.
And Argento's two American films didn't do well in the American marketplace. They didn't do well in Italy. He goes back to Italy in the mid 90s, makes Stendhal Syndrome, which does good. It does well, but it's not a huge hit. It's not one of the behemoth hits. And then after that, he makes Phantom of the Opera, which was a bona fide disaster. I like the film more than most people do. I actually think it's a really interesting film, but commercially, it was a disaster. And then from there, the budgets start to shrink. The schedules start to get tighter. And I think the big thing with Argento is, even more than money, is time. You need time
Hmm.
to be able to set up those tricky tracking shots, those elaborate shots and things that he's so well known for. When the time isn't there anymore, and the money isn't there anymore, and the support isn't there anymore from the producers. Now, at this stage, he's no longer working for his father. His father has passed away at the time that opera is going in production, is when Salvatore dies. His relationship with his brother, which was always rather fraught, pretty much collapses. And he's working for outside producers at this point, when his own production company goes down the tubes, because, again, there was some financial mismanagement that was going on. He had to file for bankruptcy at one point. So things kind of shifted and changed, and it was no longer this tremendous period of prosperity for him anymore. Most people will say that after opera, Argento's work ceases to be interesting. Um, Many of these same people would say the same thing about John Carpenter after They Live, that They Live is like the demarcation point, and everything afterwards is of no interest. I don't agree with that. I don't agree with regards to Argento. I think the two films that he did in America, there was Two Evil Eyes, an Edgar Allan Poe thing he did with George Romero. His half of the film is fantastic. Trauma, I think, is a very good film. I love the Stendhal Syndrome. I think the Family Opera is a really interesting experiment, and I quite like it. And then films after that, he made some interesting films as well. So I would say that, yes, for me, um, Mother of Tears, Giallo, and Dracula were really pretty poor films, all three of them. But then he comes back with a film like this, and I think it demonstrates that, don't write the old guy off.
Okay. Sorry. So I really enjoyed Dario Argento's autobiography, Fear, and I was wondering what you thought about it.
Oh, I thought it was great. I mean, it was first published in Italian, obviously, and then in French. And when I was doing my own book, it was not available in English, so I had some French and Italian context, translating different passages and so forth for me. That was very useful to use in my book. Now it's of course readily available in English, so you can read the whole thing from start to finish. It's very good. Argento is like most very successful people. He has his egotistical streak, and he has his little sort of narcissistic qualities at times and so forth. But I mean, ultimately, I think the book reflects the spirit of the man, which is essentially a really sort of decent, lovable old grandfather figure at this point in his career. I mean, he went from being this sort of dark, broody, um, very mannered, kind of neurotic figure throughout the 80s, where I mean, he just was painfully skinny, dark eyes, dark circles under the eyes, yeah, and very, very neurotic and fidgety and so forth, and very much kind of modeling himself on Edgar Allan Poe. And now he's this kind of, just sort of lovable old Italian granddad. And I think, the book makes for very good reading. There's perhaps certain things that he eggs on a little bit in terms of trying to give himself more credit than he should in certain areas with certain things, maybe not always giving his collaborators the credit that they're due. But you know what, that's not unusual, and I don't think he's as bad as some people in that regard. So it's a really enjoyable read.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that's great. So if somehow someone had never seen a Dario Argento movie before Dark Glasses, what are you recommending next? If they enjoyed it.
Yeah, I mean, you know, um, if this was your first one, I mean, I would think it's good enough that it would maybe make you interested to see something else. I mean, to me, the go-to is always going to be Deep Red. That to me is just the best of the best. That is his masterpiece. It is the finest Giallo ever made. Um, Bear of the Crystal Plumage is a great introduction too. I mean, it's perhaps a little more accessible in some respects. It's not quite as idiosyncratic as some of the later films. Perhaps maybe it's a little more relatable in a way. But I would always say Deep Red. I mean, if you watch Deep Red and you're unimpressed, then this is not the filmmaker for you.
Good stuff. Good call. So, Troy, thanks for your time. It was a lot of fun talking about Dark Glasses. Approximately how many new audio commentary tracks on Italian genre movies do you have coming out this year?
Oh, I don't know at this point. I've been approached to do several at this point, and that number can greatly swell as the year goes on. I think as of right now, there's probably at least about a half a dozen that are set to go.
Cool. All right. We're looking forward to it. Is there anything else you got coming out that you would like to mention before I let you go?
There is a book, possibly the start of a series that I'm working on with a Italian film historian, Eugenio Ercolani, called Unsung Heroes of Italian Cinema. And the first volume is still in the works. We both wrote about two different directors a piece. And the idea is to have directors who weren't terribly prolific. You couldn't
Hmm.
write an entire book about any of these people because there's just not enough material.
Hmm.
Put them all four together, and it makes for hopefully a good overview of four very different but very interesting careers. So I don't know that that'll be out this year. I have my doubts, but certainly if it's not this year, it'll be out next year.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Troy.
Thank you.